Welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and my guest today is Professor Andrew Pessin from Connecticut College. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate this. The um, Dr. Pessin or Professor Pessin, I don't know what you prefer. Uh, the
Andy's fine.
Andy works fine. He's written a book that came out recently, which was called Anti-Zionism on Campus. Yes, you can bring it up over there. I could show it over here as well. Very good. That he co-edited. And the topic is, unfortunately, it was very easy. It looks like it was very easy for you to fill up this book. It was all talking about different situations and different anecdotes and stories of both students and teachers on campus who ended up becoming blackballed, so to speak, because of their Zionist opinions.
Yeah, that's right. When my co-editor, Jerome Benatar at Fordham, he had a particularly troubling experience on his campus. He essentially spoke out against the American Studies Association boycott of Israel on his campus, and ended up being inflicted with like this. He was charged with a whole bunch of things. They wouldn't tell him what the charges were. He went through this whole process. He had to get a lawyer. He was eventually exonerated, but he hadn't done anything, of course. But it was a miserable experience. And when I learned about this, I got in touch with him, and he said, "Why don't we start collecting narratives from faculty members?" Was the original idea, who've basically been exposed to anti-Israel intimidation or harassment of one sort or another. And we put out a call for papers, and I think within 6 weeks we had like 40 different people, wanting to tell their stories. And we realized, wow, this is most of these stories. Every once in a while there'll be a big one that catches attention, but most of them are going on under the radar. And we realized there's a serious phenomenon here where individuals who don't even have to be particularly pro-Israel, you just have to not hate Israel. Individuals who don't hate Israel get targeted for some really nasty behavior on a lot of campuses. So that's what motivated us to put this book together.
And it's almost relentless. I mean, reading it, and beyond that, it just happens all the time. I mean, just we were just talking before, but there was one of the stories that literally came out today, which was in let's see, the name of it was in I don't. Oh yeah, the Scottsdale Community College. This is in Arizona, and so I wrote about it. You're the one that tipped me off on this, and this professor had it was a course on world politics, and in it he asked a couple of questions, and one of the sections was talking about Islamic terror, which probably already was triggering for some people, and in it he asked, hey, which does Islam, ever condone terror? Or under what circumstances does it condone terror? I don't have the name of the questions in front of me right now.
Yeah.
But it was, and everybody, one student, and again, I think this is the sort of story. This is almost like a template for how these things happen, in which one student complained, and then went public with it. And all of a sudden, the whole world starts complaining, saying, "Oh, he's Islamophobic," and the campus, the head of the campus wrote a really terrible apology on behalf of the professor, and it was craven what was happening here,
Right.
which they said, oh, we're going to force, essentially we're telling the professor he's going to apologize. It was inappropriate. It was not reflective of our inclusive nature. We applaud the students. We don't discriminate. We're not against Muslims. Blah blah blah. And
Yeah.
nobody asked, as far as I could tell, nobody asked the professor, hey, what's your side of the story?
Yeah, what's the context of this unit in this particular class, which was actually studying it? It was relevant to the material of the class, right?
Yeah.
What this reflects is this story obviously isn't directly Israel related, but it reflects this environment that's just all over campuses, which is people jumping to be offended, people being offended very, very readily and being outraged and then needing to cancel whoever offends you. And unfortunately, what's happened, you combine that sort of general atmosphere, which is on many campuses, with the more or less default assumption that Israel is one of the offensive things, and then anyone who stands up for Israel, or as I said, even just fails to hate Israel, is committing an offensive, outrageous act and gets everybody upset. So this is going on in general, and it's going on in particular for the people who are supportive of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that you don't, you're not able to talk about this for various reasons, but you yourself suffered from a similar incident. And as I said, this is almost a template. There was also like the Jason Hill incident last year. You can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. At DePaul last year, a professor, uh, Jason Hill, who was a philosophy professor at DePaul, he published an op-ed, an opinion piece, and it was a pretty strong pro-Israel piece. I mean, you don't even have to be aggressively pro-Israel to be to come under the fire. But this was a very sort of proud, unapologetic pro-Israel piece. It was supportive of the idea of annexation, which is obviously a very timely idea right now, and it was critical of Palestinians at a couple of points, and he just caused an eruption on his campus. The entire campus was, and it's not just, a campus is supposed to be a place where different people have different ideas and you disagree and you debate and you argue and you can even get upset a little bit. I think that's okay. But it's not that. It's an eruption of outrage and hurt and offense at a set of ideas, right? And these were bold ideas, to be sure, but rather than refute the ideas or engage with them or even try to point out why they're problematic, instead it's outrage and offense and hurt. And so, as I said, the campus erupted, like almost everybody. The SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, they had a whole petition going that he should be fired, that he should be essentially re-educated. He had to undergo racial sensitivity training, they were demanding. But what was really worst part of it for me reading that story was then, like, his faculty colleagues, they ended up, and this is invariably the case, breaking a bunch of procedural rules so that they could issue an official reproach and censure, like the faculty governing body censured him and reproached him. Yeah. And they don't go through the normal processes. It was all rushed, etc. They probably didn't even have a quorum or something like that. So literally his whole campus turned against him. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I read that he is now filing a lawsuit against DePaul for defamation and various other things. And it's okay on campus to have a controversial opinion. That's what we want in our campuses in general. And if you allow someone with a strong or controversial opinion, it doesn't matter what side of anything you're on, to be treated this way, then this is not a place of free speech, right? This is a place where the strong opinion gets canceled. And that, to me, it's not just a matter of defending Israel here. It's a matter of defending the values of a university. Freedom of inquiry and the progress of knowledge require the ability to entertain controversial things. And that's what we're not seeing. Anything too controversial, again, is canceled. And as it turns out, the default value on many, many campuses is that Israel is that controversial thing.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, in the specific part that I found fascinating about this, this specific case of Professor Hill is that he's black, he's an immigrant. He checks off all of the sectional areas over here where he would normally be protected for anything that he would say outrageous. But right. There's one thing that's more outrageous that does not make up for, doesn't matter how many, you could be handicapped, pregnant, transsexual, right. Any person of color, and an immigrant and a refugee. But if you're pro-Israel, then that trumps everything. Right.
I'm actually pretty sure at some point I saw one of them referring to him as a white supremacist. We're getting that in some of these cases as well. Like the Black Hebrew Israelites are called white supremacists because they're attacking Jews, right? And that just shows you, the convoluted intellectual gymnastics that go on here. So it's a scary situation.
And is it? I mean, again, you've been involved in watching this stuff for at least 5 years right now. Is it getting worse? Is there pushback?
That's a great question. For many years, I was sort of a modest pro-Israel advocate, a little bit on social media. I always kept it out of my own campus because A, my campus was quiet with respect to these issues, and B, I'm a philosophy professor. So, these issues didn't belong in any of my classrooms, and it didn't have a place. But over the last 5 years, I have been watching quite closely. In fact, I became the inaugural campus bureau editor of the Allgemeiner. That's a hard word. If your listeners are not familiar with it, I'm sure some of them will be. Allgemeiner. It's a Yiddish word. It's a terrific news outlet that covers matters Jewish and Israel, basically. And the Allgemeiner realized about 4 years ago or so that they really needed to have a dedicated campus bureau just to keep an eye on what's going on campuses. And I was privileged to be asked to perform that role, and I'm still doing that today. So I've spent the last 4 years, in addition to my day job, keeping a close eye on campuses. And as I like to tell people, I'm filled with a lot of very depressing anecdotes, so I can be a real downer to talk to sometimes. So is it getting worse? It's hard to say. From my perspective, it's been pretty consistent, high level. I do think if you want to talk about the more optimistic things, I think the pro-Israel side has woken up in the last few years. I think they were, this is obviously anecdotal, but not entirely dormant, but passive or something along those lines. And there's a lot more energy on the pro-Israel side that's happening now. So there is pushback, absolutely, that I don't think there even was 5 years ago so much. I mean, organizations like Stand With Us have done a lot of great work over the years, et cetera. But now there's more people, many Jewish people, but there's also, of course, Christian Zionists, and they're speaking up. I'd like to give a shout out to this really wonderful grassroots group, Students Supporting Israel, that started a few years ago at University of Minnesota, now has, I think, a couple dozen chapters. What I particularly like about them is they go on offense, right? Most of the time, Jews and Israel advocates tend to be on defense. It's the anti-Israel people who are, leveling all these accusations and libels and often lies, etc., against Israel. And the pro-Israel students tend to just say, that's not true, and look at all the wonderful things Israel does, and Israel does many wonderful things. What they never do, or rarely have done, is sort of, first of all, ever go after the Palestinian side, right? Ever critique Palestinians. And we see what happens, right? With Jason Hill last year, actually had a couple of sentences where he was very critical of the Palestinians. The place explodes. And you don't see so much the making of the positive case for Israel, including the claim. So this is one of the Students Supporting Israel's things. They put on events that talk about the different indigenous peoples, and they include in indigenous peoples the Jews in the land of Israel. So merely to make that assertive positive claim is such a change of pace, because then it puts the other side in the position of having to play defense and trying to refute your claims, etc. And so SSI really does a bunch of wonderful things. So yeah, our side, the pro-Israel side, has absolutely woken up. That said, it's a big job. These campuses are hotbeds. The other side tends to outnumber us dramatically. We can talk about intersectional coalitions if you like. But the other side not only outnumbers us dramatically, they tend to be more passionate. They're angry, right? They're outraged. And when I'm feeling charitable towards the other side, which I once in a while do, I imagine if you or I saw a bunch of neo-Nazis and Hitler worshippers gaining ground on campuses, we would be outraged, right? We would be fully vocal. We'd be protesting. We'd be disrupting their talks, right? How can you allow this evil presence on a campus? These are not literally Nazis, right? And the problem is the other side sees Israel as the Nazis. So I understand where the hatred and passion comes from, even though I think it's based on these contorted facts. So the other side is really angry. Right. And our side tends to be, let me give you a few rational arguments why what you're saying really isn't true, or give some more context to your claims. And when you're outnumbered and you're out impassioned, rational arguments are empty and useless. So it's a really tough climate.
I mean, I think I think you're understating the case personally, because Jews like to argue. That's what we grew up with. That's what the Talmud's all about. That's we think that, hey, a good argument answer, that's the end of it. You make your case and that's it.
Right.
But today, and it's not only on campus, but today it is, whether you want to call it outrage culture, whether you want to call it whether it's political correctness, whatever it is, but it's the people that are screaming, saying it's a victimhood. Thing. Right. The victims are the ones that automatically win. And again, I made a post a couple of years ago that people really liked, an intersectionality calculator, in which
Oh, I remember. That was fantastic. Yeah.
in which my thesis was, it doesn't matter what the merits of the argument are at all. Whoever has the higher intersectionality score will win, and
That's right.
sort of did it as a joke, and it turned out being incredibly accurate. I mean, especially with like Ilhan Omar when she said her anti-Semitic statements, and it looked like, oh, my thing wasn't going to be right, because it looked like she was going to be censured in Congress, and then everything
Right.
turned around, and she's the one that won, and it's like,
That's
what? It's like, so.
Well, she's the one because we're trying to suppress her free speech by criticizing these outrageously offensive remarks, right? And that's because you're absolutely right. Another phrase for it is the identity politics. So it doesn't matter what you say; it matters who you are. And if you're in a certain class, then you're automatically correct. And it doesn't matter how good the Jews' arguments might be about Israel. The way things are right now, Jews are at the bottom of that totem pole. They're not even on the totem pole of victimhood, right? Jews are the oppressors.
Right.
In the common conception on many campuses, and so our arguments are useless. It's like the Nazis explaining to you why they're justified. You just don't listen, and
And except even in the case of Professor Hill, he fits the intersectionality stuff, and even
right.
so, in fact, I think they're even more upset because you should be one of us. You
Yeah, that's right.
think the way we do, and then that's like it's almost even more offensive for them.
I wonder if well, I think the content of his speech was enough to outrage them, but I think you're probably right. Like to do a little psychoanalysis. I have a forthcoming book with Corinne Blackmer of Southern Connecticut State University on contemporary anti-Semitism in the United States. And we have a wonderful chapter by a young guy named Elliot Kaufman. He just graduated from Stanford a year or two ago.
Mm-hmm.
An analysis of intersectionality, and he analyzes it as a political organizing methodology. It's about coalition and solidarity building, and the idea is blocks of people who share identity must share views on everything, and to differ in opinion. So to be an African American that has a different opinion from the majority of African Americans is to commit a form of treason, essentially, right? It's not just, people have different opinions. Any group of people you would think would have some diversity of opinion amongst them. But intersectionality makes it the case that basically you're either with us or you're against us. And so I do wonder if in the Jason Hill case, part of the outrage would be like a sense of betrayal that you fit certain boxes and therefore you should be part of our solidarity and our coalition. And, how dare you not be? So
It's even worse than
be
that.
interesting.
I mean, to me, that's a sort of a racism saying that you're not expected to have your own opinions. If
Totally.
you're a person of color, then you're not even allowed to have your own opinions because that's like, you're a traitor, you're Uncle Tom, whatever they would call him. It's like,
Right.
so this is, to me, that's racism.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%.
Um, as far again going back to the question of fighting back, what happened with this case that you gave that you brought to my attention today with this Nicholas Damask of at the Arizona Community College, Maricopa County. What seemed to be the way to fight back in his case, and I'd like to know whether this is happening elsewhere, was the immediate threat of a lawsuit. It wasn't necessarily him. I think it was this other group called Fire, which I guess you're probably more familiar with than I am.
Yeah, so it's a free speech group. Yeah,
But they immediately, I mean, it looked like within a couple of weeks, it appeared to me, of the controversy breaking out, they immediately went to the campus and said, or to the head and said, listen, you are breaking First Amendment. You're doing, you're breaking state law, and
right.
we're going to, and there are legal consequences for what you're doing. And then they did a 180 like I've never seen
Yeah.
college campus before.
So I think that's a really good point. So amongst the things our side has begun, the pro-Israel side has begun to do is use lawfare as the expression. I think is maybe a pejorative expression. I'm not sure, but to use the law. And if the law is available, I mean, I'm not advocating frivolous lawsuits, but I'm saying if the law is available and you've got a case, you should pursue it. So over the last number of years, there absolutely have been legal proceedings. So Jason Hill just filed suit, as I mentioned, from this case last year. There's also this woman at Point Park University in Pittsburgh who just filed a lawsuit a couple of months ago, a faculty member, similar situation, felt she was singled out and harassed basically for being a pro-Israel person in in a pit of anti-Zionism. And of course, most importantly, thanks to the Trump's executive order, of course, which lots of people were upset about, but it gave a warning that that there's coverage for to protect against anti-Semitic discrimination. So partly due to this executive order, I think right now something like 5 or 6 major schools there have been Title VI complaints filed against them, and that includes NYU, UCLA, I think Georgia Tech, maybe that one's in progress, and a few other big ones. So the pro-Israel side is speaking up, and the threat of a lawsuit. Columbia, of course, it's a perfect example because Columbia is a fascinating institution for many reasons. I got my PhD there many years ago, and it's simultaneously the Allgemeiner a couple of years ago put out a ranking of best colleges to go to for Jews and worst, and Columbia was #1 on the worst list because of the incredibly vocal and vociferous anti-Israel SJP activity there. But by the same token, it's a great place to go for Jewish students. There's a lot of Jewish students there. There's a lot of great Jewish resources. There's a wonderful Hillel, kosher food, so it's simultaneously a great place to be a Jewish student and a terrible place, a difficult place to be a Jewish student. But the point is, the anti-Israel folks there are loud and vociferous. They put on lots of events. They have an apartheid wall. They are disruptive of the pro-Israel events. That's another campus activity, disrupting other people's lectures. And a year or two ago, I think it was the SSI group, Students Supporting Israel group, filed a formal complaint with the university where they detailed the previous 2 years of harassment that the SJP students had been perpetrating against the pro-Israel students. And it's painful to read this thing. It was quite detailed. And the university just literally ignored it. They couldn't care. The university did nothing to even restrain the SJP group, which often crosses the line, until what happened? Trump's executive order came in, and suddenly, and there's a BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions resolution forthcoming on the Columbia campus. It was supposed to happen this spring, but was postponed because of the virus. And suddenly, the president of the university puts out a very strong statement condemning BDS, and I think he was referred to it as a form of anti-Semitism. So where was he for the last 5 years? Nowhere. But now that the executive order's there and there's this Title VI complaint filed, suddenly, he's doing the right thing, right? So our side is starting to use the legal resources that are available, and more are available due to that executive order. And what changes it will make, I don't know. It will, I think, hopefully empower and encourage administrations to have a stronger hand. In fact, give another episode just very recently, you may have seen Tufts University. The SJP there, Students for Justice in Palestine group, was given a student organization award for best a collaboration award of some sort. And there's a lot that's outrageous about that. I'm happy to go on at length if you like. But the president of the university came out with a strong statement condemning the award to the student organization and promising to revisit the way these student organization awards are given out. And, one wonders, would the president have done that were there not the possibility that this could have, anti-Semitism, discrimination ramifications? So I think it's terrific that these legal resources are available and that the pro-Israel side is beginning to use them. I hope it will, at least, as I said, embolden and motivate the administrations to take stronger lines here. What changes it will make on the ground is a little bit less clear, but if you have the administration at least coming out and saying the right thing, that can only be good, seems to me.
Probably. I'm not 100% sure. I haven't been following, and I probably should have been. I never really looked at the Title VI aspect of these sort of apologies, because when I did look at Title VI, last year, it looked to me like the bar was relatively high still, to be considered, because there had to be actual discrimination. You had to actually prove, it wasn't just speech. I mean, it does not at all.
Yeah. Right. And the executive order is very clear on that, right? You preserve First Amendment, speech is always protected. But when, for example, amongst the more recent trends. So it's possible the BDS resolutions in student governments might be petering out a little bit. They hit a real peak like 5 years ago. Last couple of years they ticked up a little bit, but the tactics are always changing. And so amongst the most recent tactics is this move for student groups to boycott the Zionist groups on campus. So for example, last year, it might have already been 2 years ago at NYU, literally there was a proclamation signed by 53, I think it was, different student groups. We're talking about, obviously it's led by Students for Justice in Palestine, that's usually right at the top of the list, and the Arab and Muslim students, but all of the intersectional coalitions, so the Hispanics and the gays and the people against climate change and the people for prison reform, like all of them signed this document saying they would basically have nothing to do, would never co-sponsor with, and wouldn't interact with the members of the two sort of Zionist student groups. So if you think about what that is, that's like lunchroom bullying or something like that. Nobody's going to sit with and it's largely the Jews who are being boycotted here. So that goes beyond speech, right? That's an activity, an action where you are literally ostracizing who, some of the most vocal Jewish students who happen to be in these Zionist groups. So that's the type of thing that's crossing a line from speech into a discriminatory behavior. And there's many examples of that that's going on a bunch of universities now. There's an explicit movement to basically exclude Zionist students from any progressive movements on campus, right? I can give you a bunch of those anecdotes as well. And that's
and stuff like that. I mean, that was just
and actually in our book we had one story from a young woman, a student at Oberlin, who was very interested in supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. This was several years ago, but then when Black Lives Matter movement thought it was relevant to include a tenet in their platform condemning Zionism, she was like, well, how can I be part of this movement when they go out of their way to condemn Zionism, which has nothing to do, of course, with the main agenda of Black Lives Matter. But it's explicit on campuses. If a student is a Zionist but really cares about climate change or fossil fuels or whatever it is, prison reform, they won't let that person participate in their activities. And that's just straightforward discrimination. So that's where it gets really problematic.
It definitely is. Both. It's hard for me to say.
Let me give you one more example. I'm sorry, just once I get going, the anecdotes start. This is why I'm so depressing at parties. At Williams College last year, there was a student group wanted to form basically Williams Friends of Israel. It's like a pro-Israel student group, and just in a stunning display, the student government did not approve them. And this is supposed to be a pro forma process, right? Any student group, as long as you meet these very basic, whatever the minimum criteria are just automatically approved. And they didn't approve them because they don't approve of Zionism. And so you're basically telling this group of students, and they're overwhelmingly Jewish students. Mm-hmm. You're telling this group of Jewish students that every other student group can form and be recognized and get funding and be allowed to reserve rooms, but you can't. So that's straightforward discrimination. There was a big uproar. The president overruled it, so it ended up okay. But think about the psychological damage of those students. I actually reached out to a couple of them, and that's scarring. It's right. Like you're just suddenly you're dirty, you're impure. We don't approve of you. And how do you go on, living on a campus like that? It takes great courage and self-confidence to stay in a place where you've been told they don't want you. So even if the administration comes in and approves your student group, the damage is done. But that's discrimination at that point.
Well, it is, definitely is, and you're right. The type of student that can stand up to that, and probably where SSI and that sort of thing helps, that they can at least know that they can have a support group when
that's right.
This happens. Like even Hillel is not always the support group anymore, but like SSI is. One of the things that troubles me, and maybe it's just a little bit more, I don't want to say philosophical to you, but it's is that the two major weapons against this sort of thing right now. One is the threat of a lawsuit, and the second one is based on this Title VI thing, is like the threat of being labeled anti-Semitic. But but you did mention that SSI does this, but I would like to see more of it. Is like, and if it's even possible, because again the way that
Yeah,
things are on campus nowadays. But Israel has a case, I mean, Israel
yeah,
has
right.
arguments, and that's like, it's like it doesn't even have a chance to make these sort of arguments. And I don't know how to break through this groupthink that the anti-Israel crowd has met. And again, they've managed to brilliantly, not just, to keep it, not, they managed to make it okay, it's a Black Lives Matter thing, it's a feminist thing, it's a
Right.
climate change thing, whatever. They managed to inject this Palestinian position as if being pro-Palestinian is a liberal leftist cause, when,
Right.
and what I think the argument has to be done is like it's the exact opposite. And I think that, and I'm not sure if there's enough of that on campus, in which the argument is saying, you realize that if you're supporting the Palestinians, you're supporting people who are misogynist. You're supporting
Right.
people who are gay bashing, and Israel is the one country that in the region that isn't, that actually holds by these liberal values that you say you believe in. Like, there's such a hypocrisy over there, and I don't know how to get that argument out there. That I mean, listen,
Well,
people are, whether they're going to listen or not. People, if I think more by emotions than, unfortunately, even on campus, they think more about
right.
emotions than on logic.
Well, here's why it's next to impossible, which is in order to make that argument, you have to say some critical things about the Palestinians, and we again take the Jason Hill case, right? Like, and he stood up, he held on, and now he's suing. Good, great for him. But you say negative things about people of color or the marginalized at your peril on a college campus where you have the totem pole of victimhood, as you said, or the intersectionality calculator, right? So like the only way to make that argument is to say something bad about the Palestinians, and there's just no audience for that. And so you can't make that argument. And they've even cleverly, about like the pink washing and the green washing, et cetera. As soon as you start trying to make the positive case for Israel, well, look at how Israel fits most of the progressive values that you care about. Then it's called, if it's the gay agenda, then it's called pink washing, right? You're just, and it takes different forms, but you're just promoting that to try to distract attention from your evil ethnic cleansing and genocide, and its dispossession of the Palestinians. So you can't even make the progressive case for Israel
Right.
without them immediately neutralizing it. So
I
I
had
don't see the power of argument. Like the power of argument is not the one that's going to work here,
I had,
unfortunately.
I had a tweet actually about that a few days ago, in which, and again, I'm trying to expose exactly that sort of thinking. I'm saying, remember, if you are, a Zionist and you do anything that's liberal or moral or good, that just means that you're a bad person who's now trying to cover over for Israeli crimes. If
That's
you're
right.
Palestinian and you support terror or just pay for slay or something like that, you're really a good person, but you really have no choice.
You have
Uh,
no choice. Yes.
so
Right.
the bias is inherent. But the Palestinians are by default good people, and nothing they can do is bad, except
Right.
for being pro-Israel. And the Israeli side, or the Zionist side, is inherently evil, and there's nothing
Inherently.
they can do to be good, because by definition anything they do is evil.
Right. And that's a perfect way of making the point that it's anti-Semitism, that it's bias, which is if you know in advance that whatever the other side says, it's wrong or refutable because they're evil, then it doesn't matter what they say and it doesn't matter what they do. Right. And we know from the long history of anti-Semitism that whatever it is party X doesn't like, they blame it on the Jews. Right. So the Jews will never win those arguments. So it's devastating and difficult. And I don't have a solution, unfortunately. A lot of people are trying to figure out how to change this, and who
Yeah.
knows? Other than it seems to me, I mean, I think I've learned from my experiences and my observations over here that you don't back down, you don't apologize, right, and you don't have to explain yourself. Ultimately, you can be a proud Jew, you can be a proud Zionist. You have nothing to be embarrassed about. Someone who's interested in actually engaging, like in a legitimate way with integrity, by all means engage.
Mhm.
But someone who has already decided in advance that you're an evil white supremacist, genocidal ethnic cleanser, there's no conversation you can have with that person.
And the pride is actually a critical piece, because when people do stand up for themselves and don't, cringe and try to justify themselves and try to answer all of these things, and, well, you don't understand, right? You got to understand your point of view, but, and all that sort of thing. People are attracted to pride.
Yeah.
And so that really is, fundamentally what the best thing that Zionist students could do is just say, listen, you want to have a discussion, I'm happy to, but I'm not, if you're just trying to put me down, I'm out of here. I'm just not
Yeah.
talking to you.
No, people are attracted to pride, but when the Jewish student does it, it's a form of white supremacy because you just think you're better than everybody else, right? Like, so you'll still lose somehow. I'm getting dark and depressing now, so maybe we can shift gears or something like that. But
I wanted to also give you a little shout out, and I'll show it on the screen right now. The another book of yours, The Jewish God Question,
oh yeah, yeah.
which I enjoyed a great deal.
Oh, right there.
You have it. Look at that. You have it too. I have. I'm already showing it on the screen, but it's
Yeah.
a really cool book in which probably one has to read it very slowly and a lot of times because essentially what Andy does in this book is he goes through like about 100 Jewish philosophers and what their conceptions of God and how they think about God as well as Israel and the Bible and that sort of thing from all sides, and you managed to synopsize each of them into literally 1 or 2 pages.
Let me just clarify that minor bit of minor plug here, which is it's not trying to be like a history of Jewish thought that would try to be comprehensive on all these great brilliant thinkers. It picks out 1 or 2 interesting ideas or arguments made by different thinkers from Philo all the way until there's a contemporary Jewish philosopher, Sam Levins. It just tries to pick out 1 or 2 interesting ideas or arguments that each of these people has made and present it in as accessible a form as possible. Most of them, I think, are pretty accessible. A couple might take 2 readings or maybe even 3, but the chapters are brief. They're like 700 words. And again, you're not going to learn Spinoza's whole system by looking at this, but you'll pick out like a really interesting thing or two that Spinoza, just to use one example, or Maimonides, to use another, might have said. And the subtitle you were hinting at there is what Jewish thinkers have said about God, the book, the people, and the land. So the God question is a very broad category, but under that, certainly in the history of Jewish thought, there's a lot to be said about God, the book, the people, and the land. So yeah,
It's
fun book.
now I'm thinking about it. What do you think of like the Yoram Hazony stuff, where he's essentially positioning Jeremiah and a lot of the original prophets as being philosophers as well?
I thought that was a terrific and important book. I remember I read it right when it came out, and I definitely had some disagreements about particular points along the way. But the fundamental premise that there are philosophical views and maybe even something like arguments. I mean, the Bible doesn't read like a philosophical text most of the time, or even in the prophets. Certainly, at least not philosophy as as a trained philosopher recognizes it. But to realize that philosophical case can be made based on the Bible, I think is such an important contribution. And I think it's terrific that he wrote that book. It's is it called Philosophy in the Bible or Philosophy in Hebrew Scriptures or something like that?
I think that's it, yeah.
Yeah. So, like I said, there were things I disagreed with along the way, but that's part of the game, obviously. But such an important contribution to start thinking about the Bible and trying to see what philosophical principles might be extractable from it is terrific. So I absolutely recommend that book to anyone who's interested in these sorts of things.
Cool. And then very briefly, only because I did sort of tease it on Twitter. So I said you were a minor character on the David Letterman show in the
Minor, I am offended.
but you were a very important one. You were the genius.
Yes, listed third, right? Well, I mean, what could they do without the genius?
That's right.
As I like to say, I'm not an actual genius. I just played one on TV. So,
I'm just going to show a brief clip of, I believe it was the first episode of it, for anybody who wants to see it, and then you might be able to say a couple of words. I'm not sure if you can hear when I'm doing this, so I'll just be quiet.
I don't see it either right now, but I will say I was much younger then, so
I will let you know when it's over. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, that was yeah, it was like the first one where you did Everest. So it was very amusing. But there's for the people that are interested, there are YouTube videos. I believe there were about 4 or 5 different episodes
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. In fact, that first one, I won't bore you with the details, but basically, I knew someone who knew someone who was interning there, and it was the day before I was supposed to defend my PhD dissertation. She called me up and said, "The Letterman people want to put this video together, and they need a genius. Do you want to come down and audition?" And it was the day before my defense of my PhD, so I had to decide, like, do I go do this Letterman thing or do I prepare for my dissertation defense? And I clearly made the right choice because it was a ton of fun, and I got a minor bit of fame out of it, and now I get the embarrassment and humiliation of just seeing how young I once was and am no longer.
And what was the dissertation on?
It was on the philosophy of mind,
Oh, okay, I have no idea what that means.
and I'll leave it there unless there are follow-up questions, which I assume there won't be.
Philosophy of mind. You mean of the concept of the mind? You mean?
It was specifically on the question of how are minds able to create representations of the world, of the external world.
Okay,
So
cool.
not quite the concept of the mind, but more on the cognitive mechanisms of the mind.
Interesting. I would ask more questions, but I think we're pretty much out of time. It's
All right. Let me just mention, if anyone is interested in my work, my anti-Zionism book or Jewish God Question, and my favorite work, if I had to choose one, it's like choosing a favorite child, I suppose. They're all my favorites, but some are more favorite than others. I wrote a novel a couple of years ago, a historical murder mystery based very closely on the tragic life and mysterious death of the famous philosopher Rene Descartes, called The Irrationalist. And I'm very proud of that. It's got a lot of really great reviews. So if anyone's interested, my website is andrewpessin.com.
oh,
Just my name, andrewpessin.com. And feel free to visit and check those out.
cool. Thank you very much for coming. This was fun. And
Thank you, Elder. I should say it's such a treat to speak to you. I follow your writings quite closely. I admire you greatly. I love your stuff, and to actually be able to speak to you in person, even though I can't see you and I don't know your name, is an honor and a privilege. So thank you for thinking of me.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm just going to bring us out over here. So thanks again for everybody. This is Elder of Zion, and I will see you.